Lenora Kemple thought she could control everything from flower beds to rooftops, but she never expected resistance from someone like Adam Hayes, the quiet grandson who inherited a forgotten cabin and refused to back down. When my grandfather passed away, he left behind a small wooden cabin on the edge of Pine Hill, a quiet, forest-lined stretch far from the busy neighborhoods below. The cabin wasn't fancy. It didn't have central air or updated appliances. The roof creaked in the wind, and the floors squeaked beneath your steps. But it was his sanctuary, and later, it became mine. After years of city life and a draining job, I packed my things, left everything behind, and moved in. It felt like freedom, no noise, no neighbors, just the rustle of trees and the chirping of birds. For the first few weeks, I spent my days cleaning up the place and bringing it back to life. The old rocking chair on the porch still worked. The fireplace still lit with a bit of coaxing. I repainted the trim, cleared the fallen branches from the yard, and even managed to get the water running again without a plumber. It felt good, honest work with no one breathing down my neck. But the peace didn't last. One morning I found a neatly folded envelope taped to my gate. It was a letter from something called the Oak Springs Homeowners Association. I hadn't heard of them before. The cabin had always been considered outside any neighborhood boundaries. But according to the letter, the HOA had expanded its jurisdiction the previous year, and now included the land surrounding Pine Hill, including my grandfather's property. The letter stated that my cabin was in violation of several HOA guidelines. The list included everything from the non-uniform exterior finish to unauthorized driveway material. They even mentioned the pine tree beside the porch as being a safety concern due to proximity to dwelling. I laughed at first. It sounded like a mistake, a bureaucratic error. I tossed the letter in a drawer and forgot about it. A week later, another envelope appeared. This one was more serious. It included warnings about fines, deadlines for compliance, and the possibility of legal action if I failed to bring the property up to code. The tone was cold and professional, but it was clear they were targeting me. I asked around and learned about Mrs. Lenora Kemple, the newly elected HOA president. Locals referred to her as a stickler, the kind of person who measured grass height and checked mailboxes for rust. She was known for handing out citations for things like mismatched curtains and faded house numbers. I assumed she'd move on after seeing my cabin. Wasn't really part of her domain, but the letters kept coming. Each week brought a new complaint. The chimney didn't meet modern height requirements. The wooden fence was non-standard and inconsistent with community design. They even cited the color of the roof, a dark green that had faded over time, as a violation of approved exterior palettes. The strangest part was that I'd never seen an HOA rep or board member near the property. It was as if they were watching from a distance, documenting every detail like I was under surveillance. That's when I started wondering how they even knew so much about the cabin. It was tucked away, barely visible from the road. You'd have to hike up the hill or go out of your way to even find it. Something didn't sit right. This didn't feel like routine rule enforcement. It felt like I was being pushed quietly but deliberately, as if someone had plans for the land beneath my feet, and my presence was an obstacle. I wasn't just dealing with a nosy HOA, I was being hunted off my own property, and I had no idea why. Mrs. Lenora Kemple wasn't just another neighbor. She was the kind of person who made the rules and then rewrote them when they didn't suit her. As the president of the Oak Springs Homeowners Association, she held a level of authority that was hard to ignore, especially in a neighborhood that had slowly fallen under her control. People didn't speak badly about her in public, but behind closed doors, stories circulated. Homeowners whispered about the time she fined a couple for leaving their trash cans out for 6 extra minutes. Others mentioned how she made an elderly man repaint his house because the shade of beige he used was too warm. These weren't rumors, they were warnings. Once Mrs. Kemple had her sights on something, she didn't stop. And unfortunately for me, her latest target was the cabin on Pine Hill. At first, I didn't take her campaign seriously. I thought it would blow over once she realized I wasn't technically part of her domain. But instead, things escalated. The letters turned into citations, the citations turned into fines, and the fines grew with every week I refused to comply. They weren't small, either. Hundreds of dollars for things like unauthorized gutter angles and non-conforming mailbox dimensions. I hadn't even installed the mailbox. It had been there since the early 1980s. Still, they treated it like I'd committed a crime. Neighbors started keeping their distance. A few friendly faces I'd met early on began avoiding me. I noticed fewer waves from passing cars. One woman I used to chat with during morning walks crossed the street when she saw me coming. It was as if I'd been blacklisted. The HOA's reach wasn't just paperwork and penalties, it was influence, fear. People knew what happened when you pushed back, and no one wanted to end up on Mrs. Kemple's radar. Then came the notices about unauthorized occupancy. They claimed the cabin wasn't zoned for permanent residents. That was strange, considering my grandfather had lived there year-round for decades without a single complaint. Still, they insisted. They accused me of violating housing codes and warned me of possible eviction. The language was aggressive, but it was also vague. I started to feel like I was being boxed in with invisible walls. Legal terms and official-looking documents meant to confuse and intimidate. I tried contacting the HOA office directly, but my calls went unanswered. Emails bounced back. I wasn't even allowed to attend board meetings, they said, because I wasn't a member in good standing. The only way to regain that status was to pay off the mounting fines, which now totaled over $3,000. I didn't have that kind of money to waste on something I didn't believe in. I wasn't going to pay for the right to exist on my own inherited land. That's when the final envelope arrived. Unlike the others, it was delivered in person. A man in a suit dropped it off without a word. Inside was a formal demand. Either bring the property into full compliance within 30 days or prepare for legal seizure. The cabin was now listed as a community compliance hazard. They were no longer just issuing warnings, they were preparing to take it away. It was clear now, this wasn't about fences or mailboxes or shingles. It was about removing me. For some reason, Mrs. Kemple and her board had decided that my presence on Pine Hill was unacceptable, and they were using every tool they had, rules, fees, isolation, to force me out. The cabin may have looked quiet from the outside, but inside it had become a battleground. One I never saw coming by the time the 30-day deadline loomed. I realized I couldn't afford to wait around and hope the HOA would change their mind. Something about the way this was unfolding felt wrong, almost orchestrated. I needed to know more, so I went digging. I took a few days off from working on the property and drove to the county records office. I figured if the HOA was using legal threats, I should at least know what legal ground I stood on. The records clerk was an older man who seemed surprised anyone still bothered coming in person. He helped me sort through the dusty archive drawers and digital scans. I searched for anything tied to the parcel number of my grandfather's cabin. After nearly an hour of digging, I found something unexpected. Buried in a 1983 zoning document was a special clause. It outlined that the land my cabin stood on was exempt from any annexations or jurisdiction changes made by surrounding homeowners associations. It had been grandfathered in literally. The cabin was legally protected. Any attempts to impose HOA rules on it would be invalid. I was stunned. That one sentence changed everything. The HOA had no legal claim over the property. My grandfather must have secured this clause decades ago, probably knowing how fiercely he wanted to preserve the cabin's independence. Somehow, the new HOA board either didn't know about it or worse, they knew and were hoping I didn't. I made copies of everything and mailed them to the HOA office via certified letter. Then I waited. No reply, not even an acknowledgement of receipt. Days turned into weeks, and the silence only made me more suspicious. That's when I noticed something odd. A white SUV started parking across the street from the base of the hill every evening. Sometimes it stayed for hours. No one ever got out. I assumed it was someone lost or maybe a nosy neighbor, but the pattern continued. Then, strange things began happening around the cabin. One morning I found the front gate unlatched. Another day my trash cans were turned over, contents scattered like someone had rummaged through them. At first I blamed raccoons or wind, but something in my gut told me it wasn't nature. Someone was trying to rattle me. That's when I decided to install cameras, just a few cheap motion sensor models around the property. What I captured confirmed everything I feared. Late at night, people were entering my land. Not random trespassers. These were well-dressed individuals carrying clipboards and flashlights. They took photos, placed surveyor flags in the soil, and measured the property lines. One of the clearest videos showed Mrs. Kemple herself pointing toward the cabin while standing beside a man holding blueprints. She didn't look like someone checking for violations. She looked like someone planning a takeover. The footage made my stomach churn. This wasn't enforcement, it was preparation. They were planning something bigger. It explained the urgency, the non-stop pressure, the refusal to respond to my legal documents. The HOA wasn't just being difficult. They were actively trying to claim the land. I started cross-referencing property sales and building permits in the area. That's when I uncovered something even more disturbing. A development company, Summit Ridge Living, had recently filed paperwork for a proposed luxury housing expansion right on Pine Hill. according to their proposal. The land was cleared for future residential development under Oak Springs HOA guidance. My property was smack in the middle of it. They were counting on me giving up. The harassment wasn't random, it was a strategy. By making my life miserable, they hoped I'd pack up and sell or abandon the property altogether. With me out of the way, they could bulldoze the cabin and pave the way for new million-dollar homes. Suddenly, the citations and fines made sense. The surveyor flags, the car watching from the street. Mrs. Kemple wasn't just enforcing rules, she was facilitating a land grab under the cover of HOA policies. The quiet isolation of Pine Hill made it the perfect target. And I had been the one piece they couldn't move without a fight. I realized I had two options: walk away or go public. And after everything they had done to erase the life my grandfather built, I knew I couldn't walk. They'd picked the wrong person to push around. It was time to bring their plan into the light and expose just how far they were willing to go to take something that didn't belong to them. The cameras continued recording, and every day brought more evidence. The footage was like a puzzle slowly fitting together. Late night visits, quiet conversations by my fence line, survey flags reappearing even after I removed them. The man with the blueprints returned, this time carrying what looked like soil samples. It became clear this wasn't just about legal pressure or intimidation, this was groundwork for construction. They were treating my land as if it were already theirs. I started logging every incident with timestamps and dates. I printed screenshots from the videos and stored them in a folder. The more I documented, the more blatant their actions became. Eventually, I caught them on video lifting up my property marker and placing a new one several feet inward, effectively shrinking my boundary lines. It was subtle, but deliberate. This wasn't negligence. This was methodical encroachment. Still, no one from the HOA responded to my letters. Not even a denial. It felt like they thought they were untouchable, as if they had done this sort of thing before, and it had always worked. That's when I started talking to other homeowners in the neighborhood, quietly, discreetly. Some were hesitant at first, but eventually, a few opened up. One couple shared that they'd been pressured to sell a patch of land behind their home last year. Another man said he'd received constant fines until he agreed to let the HOA his shed space. The stories varied, but the theme was always the same: relentless pressure until people gave in. One retired veteran, Mr. Haskins, told me something that stuck with me. He said, "They don't take your home all at once. They wear you down until leaving feels like the only option left." He looked tired as he said it, like someone who had seen it happen more than once. That's when I knew I had to go further. Talking wouldn't be enough. I needed someone who could bring real attention to what was happening. I contacted a local investigative journalist who ran stories on community disputes and land conflicts. I sent her everything: videos, legal documents, copies of the old deed, restrictions, and even a breakdown of the developer's planned expansion. She called me the same day. At first she didn't believe the scale of what I was describing, but once she saw the footage of HOA members trespassing and surveying my land without consent, her tone changed completely. Within a week, she was at the cabin filming interviews and taking photos. She requested access to the HOA's meeting minutes and public filings. What she uncovered was explosive. Several members of the HOA board, including Mrs. Kemple, had financial ties to the Summit Ridge Development Group. One board member's son worked for the company. Another had sold a parcel of land to them quietly just 2 months before my first citation appeared. It wasn't just unethical, it was potentially illegal. The reporter's article dropped like a bomb. It ran on the front page of the local paper and was picked up by regional news networks within days. The headline was simple but damning: HOA caught in secret land deal, residents targeted in push for development. My story was front and center, backed by video evidence and legal documents. Mrs. Kemple and her allies tried to push back, calling it a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. The city council announced an investigation. The HOA's authority was frozen pending review. The developer paused all operations, and just like that, the pressure that had been suffocating me for months lifted overnight. But I wasn't celebrating yet. I knew people like Mrs. Kemple didn't just walk away. There was still one more chapter to unfold, and I had a feeling it would be the most important of all. After the story broke, everything changed, but not all at once. The HOA office closed temporarily for internal review. According to a sign taped to the door, Mrs. Kemple was nowhere to be seen. Her pristine white SUV stopped appearing near the base of the hill. It felt like the whole operation had gone underground, retreating into silence while the city council began its investigation. For the first time in months, There were no letters, no new finds, no uninvited visitors creeping onto my land at night. Still, I kept the cameras running. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact started stopping by again. Some apologized. Others just wanted to talk now that they weren't afraid. A few of them had their own stories of quiet pressure, unexplained citations, or sudden zoning changes. It was clear the HOAS campaign wasn't limited to me. They had been playing a long game, quietly reshaping the neighborhood to suit a development plan that only a few people at the top fully understood. My case just happened to be the one that didn't fold under pressure. 2 weeks after the investigation was announced, the city released a preliminary report. The findings were damning. The HOA had overstepped its legal authority by extending its jurisdiction into Pine Hill without the required public approval. Worse, several board members had failed to disclose financial ties to Summit Ridge Living, the development company that had filed construction proposals. The legal clause in my grandfather's deed was valid. My property had never been subject to HOA rules. Everything they had done from fines to legal threats had no legal standing. It should have ended there. But the fallout was just beginning. A group of homeowners filed a class action lawsuit against the HOA board for damages and harassment. Several former residents came forward, saying they'd been pushed out in similar ways. The local news station aired a follow-up story showing a map of properties quietly acquired by Summit Ridge, many of them previously owned by elderly residents or people who had sold under pressure. The development company denied wrongdoing, claiming it was all standard practice, but their project was indefinitely suspended. Investors pulled out. The hillside remained untouched. Mrs. Kemple officially resigned a few days later. There was no apology, no public statement, just a notarized letter read aloud at a city meeting. She left town shortly after. Her house went on the market within the month. Rumors swirled, but no one had solid information about where she went or whether she'd face charges. The city continued its investigation into potential fraud and misuse of power, but many believed she had slipped away just in time. As for me, I kept the cabin. I replaced the old mailbox, not because the HOA demanded it, but because I wanted to. I took down the worn fencing and rebuilt it stronger. I planted wildflowers around the porch, the kind my grandfather liked. The air felt lighter now, the silence finally peaceful again instead of threatening. I had my home back, but I stayed alert. I learned that threats don't always come in the form of loud arguments or forced entries. Sometimes, they come through polite letters, official-looking forms, and quiet changes made in the dark. What happened to me could happen to anyone, especially those too tired or too trusting to fight back. That's why I kept my documents organized and my cameras up, because power, once abused, tends to find new ways to return. The cabin on Pine Hill still stands, weathered and strong, just like the man who built it, and just like the one who refused to let it be taken away.